ESG in the food industry. My name's Amy. I'm a member of the marketing team here at Perry Johnson Registrars Food Safety Inc. I will be facilitating today's webinar and offering technical support to our speakers. Today, we're very excited to be welcoming Fiona Humphreys. She's BRCGS's technical manager of ethical trade and responsible sourcing, and she's here for this presentation, but we'll just introduce her in a little bit. But first, I wanted to go over some housekeeping notes to ensure audio quality. All of our attendees today are on mute. However, we do absolutely want to take any questions you might have and get you the answers that you need. So to ask a question, you can just go ahead and type it into the questions tab of the GoToWebinar control panel and click send. We'll answer as many of the questions as we have time for at the end of the slides. Some of the most common questions we get are, could I get a copy of the slides, or are you recording the session? Will I be able to watch it again? And the answer is yes, we do have the slides. They will be available on our website at pdrfsi.com. And the recording of today's webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel for you to review, or if you want to share the link with someone who couldn't attend the live session, we all absolutely encourage that. This is what the control panel probably looks like on your screen, something similar depending on which OS you're running. And if you click the little triangle on the side of the question tab, it should open up these two boxes where you can type your question in and click send. And as I said before, we absolutely encourage you to send those in. You don't have to wait until the end of the session to ask those questions. Send them in as soon as you think of them. We would love to see as many questions as possible so we get some discussion going. All right, but first I'm going to go ahead and introduce our first speaker, our facilitator here. He is Paul Demarin. He's our Senior Vice President of Food Safety and Supply Chain at PDRFSI. Paul joined us in January of last year and has over 35 years of experience in the hospitality, service, and retail agri-food sectors. Paul's a board member of the OFPA, that's the Ontario Food Protection Association, and he's also an advisory council member with the George Washington University School of Business for their digital marketing certificate program. Before he came to PDRFSI, Paul worked for 17 years in the certification industry and had clients in sectors from food safety and supply chain to brand protection and quality. Paul's also worked for many years in management system certification, and before that he was a professional chef and a consultant for over 20 years. So Paul, I will hand things over to you and you can take it away when you're ready.
Great, thank you very much, Amy. Welcome everyone to our webinar today. It's wonderful to have you here, and we hope that you're going to get a lot of value out of this topic. Let's jump right in. Today I have the pleasure of introducing you to Fiona Humphreys. Fiona has worked for BRCGS for 3 years now as the Ethical Trade and Responsible Sourcing Technical Manager after a career spanning over 20 years working in the public and private sectors on sustainability and that's agenda. Before joining BRCGS, Fiona managed a sustainability certification for tourism accommodations, actually, delivered through the UK Travel Trade Association, ABTA, and she also worked as a sustainability advisor for the London Development Agency, or the Mayor of London's functional body for economic development. And she began her career at BSI as a sustainability project manager. She is a practitioner of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment and a qualified environmental management systems auditor, although she did spend the majority of her career working with businesses to help them understand their sustainability impacts and by managing them to improve their performance. With that, Fiona, I know it's evening where you are. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to continue to interact with you throughout the webinar, but for now, I'm going to pass it over to you, and thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul and Amy. So it's lovely to be speaking to you from Twickenham in London in the UK. It's evening here, it's about 7 o'clock this evening, but I guess you're all in hopefully glorious sunshine where you are, wherever you are in the world. So I'm Fiona Humphreys. Paul very kindly introduced me, and I'm the Ethical Trade and Responsible Sourcing Manager at BRCGS. Now I'm just going to see if my mouse will let me move my slides. Yes, it will. There we go. So this is, so to introduce the webinar, I'm going to talk to you about the importance of ESG in the food industry, which, as you know, it's not really a traditional area for BRCGS. So I'm going to firstly talk to you about why BRCGS has moved into the ESG space before I go on to consider what does ESG mean in practice, its relevance to your industry, and some of the externalities that are driving its increasing importance, and some of the opportunities that it presents to the food industry businesses like yourselves. I'm then going to look at a couple of well-known brands and what they're doing on the ESG agenda, because that's always quite interesting to kind of consider. So there we go. I will get the hang of this moving my mouse. No, that's not good. Right. Oh no. So sorry, everyone. There we go. That's the right side. So why has BRCGS decided to move into the ESG space? So really simply, there are three quite compelling reasons. Specifiers and brands, and retailers indeed, are becoming increasingly aware of supply chain risks, and they want to be able to show that their products have been produced ethically and with environmental protection in mind. In tandem, consumers are more concerned about the way that people tend to be treated during the manufacture of the products that they purchase. So BRCGS has seen an opportunity to provide a more holistic assurance offer. So it's a bit like two sides to a coin, where it's not just about the physical features of a product relating to things like consumer safety, quality, or legality. It's also about non-physical attributes, such as health and safety, providing a safe environment for workers, their welfare, their employment rights, their human rights too. And so what's BRCGS's response been to that opportunity? Now, no, I'm still not going to get it. My mouse is very sensitive. There we go. So BRCGS decided to develop a new global standard for ethical trade and responsible sourcing. So this is the first step that BRCGS has taken into the ESG space. And we did this development in consultation with a broad range of external stakeholders in industry, academia, certification bodies, and standards users as well. And the global standard represents the first step that BRCGS has taken into the ESG space and offers manufacturing sites the opportunity to be certified. The standards requirement include labour standards, human rights, health and safety, and corporate governance. So they predominantly look at the S and the G in ESG. BRCGS anticipates looking more closely at the E in the not too distant future. So we're blending a much more holistic offer for our customers, for the sites that use our standards. In addition, BRCGS is likely to be the very first standard to achieve the Consumer Goods Forum's Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative benchmark. And we're waiting for confirmation on that next week. So it's very, very, very soon. SSCI is the GFSI, the Global Food Safety Initiative's equivalent for social standards. And once we've achieved it, it will show that the Global Standard for Ethical Trade and Responsible Sourcing has solid social requirements. Unlike all BRCGS's product safety standards, it will have the same compliance management framework underpinning the certification program. So I'm now going to move on to sort of what ESG means and how it's relevant to the food industry. Let's see that. Right. There we go. So how is it relevant to the food industry? So it's actually a term, ESG is actually a term that's come out of the investment community, the global investment community, and stands for environmental, social and governance. It represents the non-financial measures that are used by investment companies and shareholders to evaluate the overall sustainability risk and performance of a business. For example, as well as considering the tangible financial performance, so the tangible risk factors of food industry businesses, for example, investors are increasingly looking at the way that businesses manage and reduce ESG impacts, which, as I've said before, are the intangible issues related to running a business.
Fiona, I have a question. Why, as a food company, should I be concerned about ESG or my ESG impact, and what do you think is the benefit to the business to allocating resources to this issue?
Well, my presentation is going to cover a lot of that question, but kind of in brief, I mean, I've just flicked to the next slide, which is a picture of the world, and climate change is on there. So without getting too preachy, all businesses, all citizens of the planet have sort of a shared responsibility to make a contribution to alleviating the impacts of climate change, because we are in the middle of a climate crisis, as we're all very aware of. We're seeing the extreme weather events, etc., coming up. And you know, I was listening to the radio earlier today, and they were talking about the serious floods that happened in Germany this year over the summer, which were completely unprecedented and caused obviously a lot of impact to people's lives in Germany, but it also killed people as well. You know, people died in the flooding. And this is unfortunately not an isolated occurrence. It's happening, you know, all over the world. And we have in the Western world, it will impact on us, but we've got countries all over the world that are poorer, and their landmass sits at a lower level, and therefore they're already prone to flooding. And there are islands in the Asia Pacific region that will simply disappear, because as the climate warms, the sea levels will rise, because the ice caps are melting at the different the south and the north pole of the world. So the case for managing impacts, I suppose, from a global perspective, I suppose what I'm trying to say is we all have our part to play, both as individuals but also as businesses. And there's a lot of scope to make a difference, and there are some benefits to doing this, to putting time and resources into this, that I'm going to cover in the presentation. That actually there is a business case for doing this, not just around the social good of, you know, kind of protecting vulnerable people around the world, but you know, you can save money if you manage your environmental impacts, and if you manage your social impacts, it can have a positive effect on the way that your business operates and the culture of your business. So without sort of disclosing the rest of my presentation, I'll probably stop there.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you very much. Okay,
great. So I'll quickly go back to the issue of climate change, which I really have talked through this slide now. But so I talked about, you know, kind of the issues, the extreme weather events that are directly related to climate change and global warming as well, which cause, you know, this disruption in our weather systems. And that can be anything from the flooding that I just described to heat waves, water shortages, and all of that can impact on global supply chains and cause massive business continuity issues for businesses, but particularly in the food industry. And obviously the food industry is a resource hungry industry in terms of the use of energy and water. The industry consumes high levels of resources, and it also produces quite a lot of waste, particularly around packaging and particularly plastics, and that's been in the news all over the world recently about the damage that plastics are doing to the oceans and the plastic islands that are in certain parts of the oceans, and microplastics going into the food chain, etc. So ultimately, all of these issues go back to contributing to the emission of direct and indirect greenhouse gas emissions, which again, that accelerates climate change and has a significant contribution to that. So I'm going to look now at the particular impact areas for the food industry. So looking firstly at the environmental impacts, and it really isn't just media headlines or hype or scare stories or anything like that. This is kind of happening, unfortunately. In the article, environmental impacts of the food and agricultural sector, Our World Data in 2020, last year, stated that food production, so I'm now just going to read you some statistics related to the environmental impacts of food and agriculture. So food production globally accounts for over a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions, so that's 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore is a major contributor to climate change. Over half the world's habitable land, so that's land that doesn't have ice or desert areas, is used for agriculture. 70% of global freshwater withdrawals are used for agriculture. So that's water that could be used, drinkable water that could be used by, humans and other species. 78% of global ocean and fresh water is subject to eutrophication, which is essentially the pollution of waterways and oceans that's caused by nutrients-rich pollutants that are used in agriculture. So fertilizers that use high fertilizers that contain high levels of nitrogen, for example. They go into the watercourses, they cause algal blooms. It can be extremely poisonous and causes pollution incidents. So, and then the last statistic I have is 94%. This is the one that I probably find most shocking myself, but 94% of mammal biomass, excluding human beings, is livestock on the planet, where they outweigh wild mammals by a factor of 15 to 1. Of the 28,000 species evaluated to be threatened with extinction and are on the International Union of Conservation and Nature's red list, so they're, species that are very, very at risk of extinction, agriculture and aquaculture is listed as a threat to 24,000 of those 28,000 species. So that kind of, for me, that really brings it into sharp focus once you come away from the climate change, the direct climate change data. And then, so the food industry is at the heart of tackling all of these issues, not just climate change, but reducing water stress, reducing pollution incidents, restoring lands back to forests or grasslands, so more sustainable agriculture, and protecting the world's wildlife. Within my slide, there is a reference where you can actually access that report. There's a web reference. It's quite a big report, but it's quite interesting reading if you're interested. So I guess after all of those difficult to hear statistics, what I'd like to say is that the food industry is very much a part of the solution. So we focus on the solution in this and not on, you know, kind of what's happened so far. That's the way that I look at these things. So next slide. So the social impacts, the social under ESG, which encompasses a variety of issues, some of which you can see on that screen, largely related to labour standards and protecting the employment rights of workers. And you can see a range of issues on the screen in the graphic, which range from reasonable working hours that don't go over 60 hours per week. That's set by the International Labour Organization. There is an international convention that informs most legislation in most countries that have signed up to the convention across the world, that says that if a worker's hours goes over 60 hours, and that's 48 normal working hours and 12 hours overtime, over that, that's considered unreasonable and actually illegal in most countries across the world. And then you've got reasonable working hours. So you've got reasonable working hours, fair pay, no discrimination. That's really important. So everybody has equality of opportunity. Everybody is treated fairly, and no child labour as well. So children under the age of 15, according to the International Labour Organization's Convention on Child Labour, should not be working on a site. And then we've also got the right of workers to join or form a trade union, which is known as freedom of association. It's actually a fundamental human right. So it's workers can join or form a trade union and then make representations to the management and collectively bargain on issues that affect their workplace rights, like pay, working conditions, etc. So across the world, these issues are generally highly regulated in law, although that doesn't stop unscrupulous employers from breaking the law by treating their staff unfairly, and we'll touch on these issues in a while. For example, I use workers in chicken plant slaughterhouses in the US who were so scared to ask for toilet breaks or take toilet breaks that they ended up wearing nappies during shifts, or abusive treatment of workers on Brazil nut farms in Bolivia, which was found to range from physical aggression to sexual harassment. I mean, obviously none of that is okay. And that's what we're trying to do when we're managing social issues in the employment rights area, is to eliminate some of these bad practices. Then health and safety, again, hugely regulated area in most parts of the world. It's a big aspect of social sustainability and ensures that the working environment of a site is safe and protects both the physical and psychological well-being of staff. Sites should be able to demonstrate that they understand the risks and hazards on the site, and can show that they've taken measures to manage them. So sites identify where their hazards are, they put through risk assessment, and then they put measures in place to treat those risks, hopefully eliminating them. But you know, if they are still in existence, then they can put things in place like giving staff PPE to wear if they're using harmful chemicals, if those harmful chemicals don't have a less harmful alternative, for example. And again, even though it's highly regulated, it doesn't stop the unscrupulous sites from breaking the law. For example, on tomato farms in southern Spain, workers were found to be continuing to work whilst harmful pesticides were sprayed around them in the polytunnels that are used to grow tomatoes in that region. And additional, the workers, who were often migrants from Morocco and predominantly women, were finding themselves living in the most shocking accommodation, makeshift accommodation, where there was no running water or electricity, which, as you can imagine, not okay. The next area, human rights. There's been a lot of attention in the media about human rights, and that's not going away. And this is about safeguarding the human rights of individuals, workers. For example, the site needs to understand where its actual and potential human rights risks might exist in their operations and that might affect their workers, so that wherever possible they have plans in place to eliminate them, ensuring that issues such as forced or bonded labour or human trafficking aren't present within their operations. Sadly, these types of human rights abuses are particularly relevant to migrant workers that tend to be used in the food and agricultural sector at peak times. They're brought in with by sort of third-party labour providers that sometimes have unscrupulous practices, and they take their passports away. They make them pay massive deposits for their jobs that they can't pay off, so they never see their wages. That's an example of bonded labour. Or they're just taken out of their countries without giving any kind of, against their will, and made to work. And that's human trafficking and forced labour. So left unmonitored, you know, these unscrupulous recruiters will make all sorts of terrible, you know, they will lie to people to say that they'll have inflated wages and they'll have all sorts of benefits if they pay deposits. And when the people get to their jobs, they realise that they've got the worst conditions to live in. The factory don't look after them properly. They're working really long hours. They take their identity papers away, which basically means they can't return home. In some instances, it's been found where workers have been threatened that their families will even be hurt if they don't stay and work for these appalling wages. So it's really, these people are really not nice. It's often linked to organised crime, and you know, this is why it's such a risk area for ESG in the food industry. So, for example, on cashew nut farms in Vietnam, they use involuntary prison labour. So prisoners are made to work as a part, under the guise of it being a rehabilitation programme for drug users. Whether or not it is, it's unlikely, but the prisoners are given no choice, but they have to work. So it's a form of forced labour. Or on Brazil nut farms in Bolivia, where workers often take out advanced loans for their jobs, meaning they find it difficult to leave employment because they're paying back the loans, leaves them open to further exploitation. And then we will move on to governance and corporate governance. So these issues are very much moving up the agenda, and there are more and more laws being put in place in countries across the world that mean that there's an increased focus on ethical business practices, transparency within the operation of a business, how it's run, with focus on the elimination of issues such as bribery, corruption and fraud. Data protection is also, you know, sort of screaming up the agenda as well, so, and information security, so the way that a business deals and stores personal data, that's become increasingly important. Governments globally recognise the risks associated with corporate governance, which means that there are more laws, which means that the directors and boards of companies in the food industry may find themselves more exposed to prosecution if these issues aren't managed properly. So that can result in fines. In some instances, it can even result in prison terms if these issues aren't robustly managed. And in turn, you know, all of these issues have an impact on brand value and shareholder value, as well as consumers increasingly wanting to see more transparency and more responsible business practices from the manufacturers, retailers and brands involved in getting their preferred products onto the shelves. And, you know, consumers will talk with their wallets, and if they're not happy and they see a bad story, they will buy a different product. So it will have an impact on the bottom line of producers, retailers, brands alike. And then we'll go on to consumer drivers now. So consumers have a major role in influencing the sustainability agenda within the food and agricultural sector. And arguably they are the most important because their voice is actually quite loud. So through consumers' purchasing patterns, they can have a major impact on which foods are produced and how they're produced. In recent years, consumer attitudes in developed countries towards sustainability have changed significantly, with ethical trade and environmental issues increasingly topping their agenda, so informing, you know, their decisions about what they're buying.
Fiona, sorry, just to go back there, you've spoken about several things already. What would you say is the #1 priority that food industry can collectively begin working on right now that will potentially have the biggest impact?
Oh gosh, that's such a big question. That is such a big question. I mean, I know there are trade associations in the USA at the moment who are working on things like packaging and plastics. I know this work has been slightly suspended because of the pandemic and the issues relating to food safety and infection control, but I know that's a really big area where change could happen very quickly and very significantly if the whole industry came together, you know, and put in place a shared approach. And also, you know, kind of the whole energy efficiency issue, because, you know, on refrigeration and cooling and ventilation in production areas, etc. And that's a big one as well. And that's actually there are big pluses to that, because obviously if you can find more energy efficient ways of producing the products that you manufacture, you're going to save money on your energy bills. So actually there is payback there. And, you know, energy efficiency is about, it's very much a doing thing, and it's not necessarily about installing lots of expensive technology. It's about understanding where you're using your energy and putting in measures that will reduce that usage. And it's, you know, so, you know, you put your measures in, then it's talking to your workforce about what you're trying to do and getting their engagement as well, so that it isn't just a policy on a wall or in a management system or whatever. It's something that everybody recognizes is important.
Right.
You get a whole industry doing that, you're going to reduce carbon emissions. So,
right.
No, so that would be my 2 starters for 10.
Perfect. Thanks.
Okay. So I'm just gonna sort of read off some more statistics for you about consumers and their buying behaviour and how that's impacting. So a company called Nielsen in 2015, back in 2015, that's 7 years ago, suggested that while 66% of global consumers are willing to pay more for sustainable brands, that percentage rises to 73% when you're looking at global millennials, so the younger generation of adults that have been brought up with a higher awareness of environmental impacts, for example. Then we have Corteva AgriScience confirmed that 52% of European consumers are willing to pay up to 20% more for sustainable food products. UK example, sales of sustainable food and drink increased from £5.7 billion in 2013, and that went up to £8.2 billion in 2018. So that's a massive acceleration, and that includes the sale of organic products, fair trade, Rainforest Alliance certified coffee, for example, or chocolate, Marine Stewardship Council certified seafood as well, so sustainable fishing. And then the Fair Trade Foundation produced a survey which is called Trade Trade Fair Live Fair, which found that under a third of consumers prioritised paying workers a fair living wage and ensuring that animals were not harmed in the production of products, food-based products. 40% of respondents said that their top priority is that food and drink is produced in a way that does not harm the environment. You know, they're big figures. So it's really showing that consumers are increasingly concerned about these issues. They also want to know where food comes from. What's the food's provenance? Is the food authentic? Where does it come from? The demand for more transparency around informative labelling is driving, you know, more information about the calories in food and more storytelling around brands and it's also the brands around the origin of products, and it's also increasing the demand for certification and standards, and consumers are becoming much more vocal about production practices that they deem to be unacceptable, and more and more pressure is being put on retailers and manufacturers to act. So these drivers are, you know, making a difference, and they are driving change within the food industry that will have a positive impact on climate change, on deforestation, habitat and biodiversity loss, etc., that I talked about previously. And I'm just going to look at a couple of examples. The first one relates to palm oil, which has been in the media quite a lot recently, and the impact of the production of palm oil on diversity in Southeast Asia, and the decline of orangutan species, for example, and their habitat loss, and that will because of the food that they eat being just basically obliterated, and other species, of course. So many consumers now avoid products that contain palm oil due to the unacceptable agricultural practices, and that is linked to deforestation and habitat destruction. When focus groups were run in Germany, it showed that consumers expressed negative sentiments towards palm oil, and that there was a strong preference for palm oil free products. There's a retailer in the UK called Iceland, and they've eliminated palm oil from all of their own brand products and found alternatives. Similarly, many other food manufacturing companies have switched to using sustainable palm oil. There is a certification that will, you know, confirm sustainable palm oil. Palm oil has been produced sustainably, or they've just looked for alternatives, for alternative fat sources in their products. And then moving on, plant-based, that's another thing that's becoming more and more relevant with consumers. There is a sort of a movement now in developed countries towards more plant-based proteins and their perceived environmental benefits. I mean, it's early days and the jury's out, I think, as far as I can see, but I think early signs are that plant-based protein does provide a viable alternative. And analysts project that the market for plant-based protein and lab-created meat, which is a whole new thing that I'm learning about, where meat is effectively grown in, you know, kind of great giant petri dishes, and it's meat, but it's, you know, obviously not farmed meat. These meat-based alternatives, this market in the US could be worth as much as $85 billion by 2030. So it's absolutely massive. Much of the market's been driven by startups like Beyond Meat or Impossible Burger, although other investors are entering into the marketplace, and you've got the likes of the world's biggest meat producers like Tyson or Smithfield or Perdue or Hommel, who are introducing blended options where they're blending part meat, part plant-based constituents into a burger. And you've got the likes of Perdue selling blended nuggets where they're mixing poultry meat with cauliflower and chickpeas. So that's another trend. And of course, BRCGS has its plant-based global standard, which is in issue 1. It was launched last year in response to these consumer drivers and the expanding the rapidly expanding portfolio of plant-based products in the marketplace. And these standards, this standard is a comprehensive management system designed to provide manufacturers with a way of showing that their product is plant-based and certifying through an on-pack trademark that allows consumers to actually easily and quickly identify that, yes, this is a plant-based certified product, and therefore we know we're eating a plant-based product. And then we've got food packaging, which I've talked about before. In 2019, the Grocery Manufacturers Association in the US found that more than 3/4 of Americans think that the federal government should intervene to reduce packaging waste. Some 86% of Americans agree that plastic and packaging waste use is actually an environmental crisis. In the Global Web Index's 2019 Sustainable Packaging Unwrapped report, again, my presentation has a link to that report, 64% of consumers prefer packaging that incorporates recyclable materials, and nearly half do not want overpackaged products. And with COVID-19's own impact on food industry trends due to restrictions, this work has been, somewhat stalled. But I think we're going to see much more of the bring your own containers to refill at the supermarkets for things like cereal-based products, etc., and to overcome, kind of some of the packaging challenges that we have. These issues won't go away. They are going to increase, and it's really important that food and agriculture businesses understand these long-term trends and make the strategic investment decisions now to start these changes happening. So having a proactive approach means that you're ready to address these issues, because legislation is going to come. It's going to cost money as a result. So be ready sooner rather than later, I guess is my message. And then the next thing that we move on to is ESG and investors. I mentioned that ESG came out of the investment community, and it's one of the key drivers for institutional private wealth and retail investors and the way that they evaluate their investments, along with the financial risks. So the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance estimates that at the start of 2018, global sustainable investment had reached $30.7 trillion across Europe, USA, Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, which is a 34% increase since 2016. That's massive. That's just, and that's a trend. That's an upward trend. That's not going anywhere apart from up. Basing investment decisions on ESG criteria has a critical role in long-term investment strategies, because shareholders are demanding more value-based investment options. And in a study that was conducted by Alex Edmonds in 2012, even back then, he showed that companies had a higher commitment to ESG issues. They outperform others in the marketplace who don't, both operationally and financially over the longer term. And in fact, he found that companies listed in the 100 best companies to work for in America generated 2.3% to 3.8% higher stock returns per year than their peers between 1984 to 2011. So, these are quite compelling figures. So with ESG investor focus set to increase, because the growth of the millennials, they're coming through, they're the ones making investment decisions, they're the ones that are going to be making the critical investment decisions over the next 20 years. So more than $30 trillion are projected to fall under the control of millennials who are responsible for investments. So that generation, they've been raised knowing about the climate crisis, and they are going to be very committed to making more conscious investments based on values and their own personal priorities as well. So if the food industry business wants to attract investors in the future and grow, then they need to think about ESG issues and get their credentials polished up, ready to go, if they want to attract the right kind of investments and the right level of investments.
Fiona, what type of challenges do you think a food manufacturer could encounter with the ESG initiatives, and how do you think they might overcome them?
Well, probably, I mean, there are challenges, because you start off with a low cost, no cost approach, where you look for the things you look for your early wins that don't cost you too much money. So, the idea is that you demonstrate what can be achieved by, kind of little steps. But ultimately, it's the bigger ticket items, things like building management systems that you can put in place that control kind of the temperature of specific areas within a manufacturing facility, and you can get a lot of data from these systems. That costs money to implement. But the biggest challenge will always be the people that work in the factories, not because they don't want to do the right thing. It's because just because you have the most fancy, all singing, all dancing building management system that money can buy, if the workers aren't using it, then it's not worth the money that you've spent. You will be no more sustainable than the day before you have the system installed. So making sure that you've got the buy-in of your staff, making they're trained and they understand why they're being asked to do these things. So in the same way that food safety, you train out your staff on food safety issues, and so that they follow procedures that kind of keep products safe and legal, etc. You need to have the same approach for sustainability, so that you bring your staff with you. And it's about culture change, changing the mindsets of people. It's often challenging because they've worked in a particular way their whole working lives, and that that in itself is a challenge. But so I would say that's probably one of the biggest challenges the sector will come across, but it's not insurmountable. It just takes time.
Okay, yeah, perfect. And I do have a few more questions for you, Fiona, but just in the interest of time, I'm going to let you get through your slides, and then we can save those till the end. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. I'll try and pick it up a little bit. So we talked about investment drivers, and now hopefully we will go to regulatory drivers. I've talked about increasing regulation around all of the issues, all of the environmental issues related to carbon emissions and the energy efficiency and land use and permits, etc. And legislation tends to look at the responsible source of natural, the responsible use and protection of natural resources such as fossil fuels, the substitution of the use of fossil fuels by more sustainable alternatives like wind generated energy or solar power or biomass boilers or whatever. Then the protection of marine resources, that's also a highly regulated area to prevent overfishing. Food waste, reducing food waste, finding clever ways where that can be diverted from landfills so that doesn't create harmful greenhouse gas emissions like methane, which is actually worse than CO2 and accelerates climate change more quickly. It's a higher contributor. Anyway, so failure to comply with legislation will have there will be prosecutions. It will impact on brand reputation. I've already mentioned there could be fines, there could be prison terms. It will stop investors from wanting to invest. It's a really big deal. It's essentially a license to operate for the food industry complying with legislation in this area. I've already talked about some of the opportunities for the food industry. I've talked about lower energy bills by managing energy, knowing where you're using it across the site, finding opportunities to reduce that usage. So having a lighting schedule, for example, so that you know when areas aren't in use, the lights are switched off, ventilation switched off as well, and that's only switched on when there are workers working in those areas or for a food safety issue. Finding alternatives, you know, to lighting, using LEDs, using, you know, low energy alternatives. And then I also talked about the longer term investments, which might be about microgeneration, installing, you know, kind of solar panels on all the roofs. Obviously that requires investment. Talked about the building management system, the digital building management system. Amazing, actually, amazing what you can do with that, and the level of data that you can get from a building management system. It pays for itself over time, but it is a longer term investment. You know, and other technologies like air or ground source heat pumps that that can be used to power a plant, or biomass boilers where you use your waste in a biomass boiler to power the plant, you know, so it's kind of more circular way of providing energy. And then with social sustainability, the big opportunities around increased staff satisfaction. As you know, recruiting staff is an expensive business. So by showing your workers that you are proactively managing issues around their employment rights and considering issues around diversity and equal opportunity, making sure that they all have access to training, making sure that you recognise and reward them when they've done a great job. People are promoted on merit, not just because of who they are. This will all increase engagement. In addition, consulting with staff on issues that affect them and involving them in the development of the site's ESG strategy, that is likely to increase their commitment to their jobs. I've seen it time and time again in all the industries that I've worked in, that people are incredibly proud to be involved with a company that cares about these issues. It increases their job satisfaction. It changes the culture of the site. People are happier. People stay in their jobs. Why would they move? Because they're happy. You know, that reduces cost. You know, products are safer as a result of staff being more engaged. People follow food safety protocols, etc. And ultimately, that means that the products they produce are of a higher quality, which means customers are happy and they repeat buy. So it's kind of good on many levels. And then we have the governance issue, where the food industry, for all the reasons that I've said about brand reputation, I mean, nobody can afford to have their brand reputation pummeled because of not taking responsibility for legal issues and, you know, exposure to fines, prosecutions, as I've said before. It impacts on the investment community as well. And a strong sustainability brand attracts higher caliber staff. Millennials in particular choose their next employer based on ESG issues. So if they see an employer that's got a great track record on environmental protection and looking after staff, and, you know, people talk as well, you know, kind of in industry, and that's a really good employer. They're in the top 10 of America's best companies to work for. I want to work for them. So that will help good quality candidates come forward during recruitment. So I'm now going to briefly look at couple of the biggest brands in the world and what they're doing on the ESG agenda. And these are really just highlights. So for McDonald's, they are committed to securing a thriving food system for the future, and they acknowledge their responsibilities with regard to mitigating climate change impacts and finding more sustainable ways to feed people. They produce an annual ESG report, and their environmental results show that they really do mean business. And I'll just read you a couple of statistics. Again, these notes are in my presentation, which I believe will be circulated afterwards. So on climate action, they have made an 8.5% reduction in the absolute emissions of their restaurants and offices since 2015, and they're using 2015 as a baseline. With a 5.9% decrease within their supply chains as well. And that is no mean feat. That means they really do mean business. They're working with their supply chains to make this happen. That's incredible. They have, on packaging, they have 80% of their guest packaging comes from renewable, recycled, or certified sources. So they're being really selective about how they're packaging the products that go out to the consumers in their stores. And they're doing so much work on sustainable beef and agriculture, where 99.4% of beef sourced for McDonald's restaurants support deforestation-free supply chains, are supported by deforestation-free supply chains by the end of last year. That's incredible. You think about the headlines around McDonald's a few years ago, and the destruction of the Amazon rainforest for the production of beef that was being sourced in McDonald's restaurants. Well, they've sorted that out, and I think that's really incredible. And they're doing loads on palm oil as well, and looking to use sustainable palm oil within their products across their product range. And then looking at Nestle. They produce an annual sustainability report, and they focus across a massive range of ESG issues. So I'm not going to talk to all of those issues. I just wanted to focus on what they've been doing on human rights over the past decade, particularly in terms of understanding and managing child labour within their supply chains. In 2012, they became the first company in the cocoa industry to introduce comprehensive child labour monitoring and remediation systems. So they're finding where child labour is happening, and they're not just sort of sacking the children and sending them away. They are putting in place measures to make sure those children are protected, they get an education, and they're able to engage in society economically once they're adults. So they're doing amazing work. In 2013, they became the first really big brand to openly report on child labour risk within their supply chain. That's incredibly brave, and they continue to follow up on this work. I mean, there's loads more statistics about the number of employees they've trained on human rights issues, so that they know what to look for within, kind of their area of work with regard to child labour. It's really incredible. And then within their annual review, which is a separate report that they produce, more on the ESG focused agenda for the investment community. And they've, in 2020, the Nestle board reviewed their governance framework to make its risk and ESG responsibilities more explicit. So their board are reaching out to the investment community to show them what they're doing, and their shareholders, as to demonstrate to their shareholders that they're taking responsibility for these issues. They've also got a renewed oversight on climate change, human rights, people management, including diversity and inclusion. It's incredible. It's definitely worth looking at what these companies are doing, because they really do. I mean, obviously they have mature programs, but it's demonstrating the art of the possible and what impact they are having on the lives of people who are working factories all over the world, who would otherwise perhaps be being treated unfairly and with human rights abuses, etc. I mean, it's just incredible. It blows me away when I read about stuff like that. So that's it. I'm at my last slide, and gosh, I have talked an awful lot, and I do apologise. I hope I've provided a snapshot on the importance of ESG in the food industry. I could talk for hours on this issue, I think. I hope I showed the opportunities that you have as an industry when you're addressing ESG issues, both in the short and the long term, and ultimately by managing your ESG impacts, both individually but also as an industry, as a sector, you'll not only be doing the right thing by showing proactive leadership, it will also help you to preserve and improve your brand reputation, your value, and you'll be readying as an industry for the challenges of the future.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Fiona. That was amazing. I'm going to pass it over to Amy so that we can get right into audience Q&A. We really appreciate it.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Fiona. All right, while you guys get your questions in, remember you can open that questions tab right on the control panel, type your question in and send it our way. Just wanted to give a quick snapshot of some of our upcoming webinar sessions. Just like this webinar today, all of these are complimentary, free to register. So feel free to sign up for as many as you'd like. They're available at peterfsi.com/webinars. But I am going to go ahead and open up the questions tab myself and see what's in there. All right, we've got a question here, Fiona, from someone looking for more information on the plant-based and ethical trade and responsible sourcing standards from BRCGS. Do you have any resources or a place for them to contact that you would recommend that they look for?
Yeah, I mean, that's, if you go to the BRCGS website, you'll see that it's organized by standards. So if you click into the stand, so that's brcgs.com, and then if you go into the standards, each standard has huge amount of resources. So you can, from being able to download a free copy of the plant-based standard or the ethical trade standard, through to sort of signpost training and other resources as well. So the best place to go in the first instance is the BRCGS website.
Great, thank you. And there's a question here, just looking for your perspective on, obviously next month is COP26, the Climate Change Conference internationally. What do you think might come out of that for the things that might impact the food industry?
Well, I mean, it's quite interesting because sustainability specialists like myself hold our breaths every time we have a COP coming up, because we hope that this will be the one where global governments will come together and do the thing that they need to do to address climate change. And it's happened piecemeal at previous COPs, but I think it's going to be this one where we're going to see the legislation on energy efficiency and how the emissions of companies are managed, and high polluting sectors. There will be more legislation coming out of that. I mean, it won't happen immediately, but there may be more pressure on the food industry to reduce emissions, and it may well prompt kind of the industry to come together and actually put a plan together that addresses, and this is a big task because it's a global sector, and and it's extremely diverse as well. So that's no mean feat, but that's what I would hope, that the expectations with regard to legislation will drive more collaborative working within the sector, and by doing so there'll be an opportunity to share ideas peer-to-peer, organize, business to business, but also to transfer that knowledge to the developing world as well, so they don't go down the route of the developed world and make the mistakes that we've made in the past. So we can bring the developing world with us, so that they are able to compete, I guess, and benefit from some of the economic development opportunities that will be presented within this equation. So it's, as I said before, you can look at this area as you know, the world's going to end, oh my God, it's so disastrous, or you look for the opportunities where we can all work together to solve this problem. So that's what I hope will happen. Whether it does is another thing. But
Right. All right. We have a question here about the ethical trade and supplying certification. Why should BRCGSs be chosen over other options like SMETA or SEDEX? Any insight onto that?
do you know what? I haven't done a webinar where this doesn't come up, and it's a really fair point. So thanks to the person that asked this. So there are two big reasons for me why a site might choose the BRCGS ethical trade standard over the alternatives in the market. The first one is that hopefully in this month, October 2021, the ethical trade standard will become the first standard to be recognised against the Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative benchmark. We'll be the first in the world. That will help to level the playing field. That's not something that the likes of the SMETA methodology or SA 8000 or BSI Amphori are yet to do. I don't think any of those, and they are the main alternatives, I don't think any of them are even in the recognition process. So that's going to make it easier for specifiers to say, well, we only work with standards that have SSCI recognition. So it makes it easier for sites to make those informed choices. So if Tesco or I know Walmart, let's say, decide, right, we're just going to work with SSCI standards, that's their approved list, you know, any standard that's got the benchmark. So hopefully that will make the choice for sites less restricted, let's say. And then the second thing that makes us different is that for the ethical trade standard, we have the same compliance management framework that has been developed over the last 20 years, a very mature compliance management framework that's robust. And I mean, I work for the BRCGS, but I'm going to say it, it's best in class. I've not seen anything as robust in terms of managing consistency of audit outcome and reliable certification for product safety. We're using the same approach for the ethical trade and responsible sourcing standard. A core part of this for the ETRS standard is that sites cannot be certificated if they have outstanding non-conformities. Now, with other systems, without naming them, they will allow non-conformities to run and be left open, and they're not certifications, you know, so they're not rubber stamping. We are saying if a site meets the requirements of the ETRS standard, the certification body will certify, they will confirm certification. So, and that provides sites with, you know, more than just, I don't know, a SMETA report to say we've had a social audit and these are the issues. Our standard says we've had a social audit, we've defined the issues, we've closed the issues, and we're really proud to have achieved this quite difficult certification. So for me, that's the crux of the ETRS standard, really, those two things.
All right, thank you so much for that insight. I know we've run over by a couple of minutes. If anyone had any last second questions, just toss them right in that questions tab. If you have another question that's maybe too complex to really type into the question box, or maybe it's more of a sensitive nature specific to your business, I would absolutely encourage you to reach out to us at PagerFSI. We'd be more than happy to forward any questions along to Fiona or get them into the hands of someone who can answer them the best. But at that, if there's no other questions, I am going to encourage you all to register for other upcoming webinars. And I'm going to thank everyone for taking the time to attend. And Fiona, thank you for staying up late and putting in the extra hour and some change to come and speak with us and share all this great information. We really appreciate having you on.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Paul, for being in on the webinar as always, and I will wish you all a happy and safe rest of your week.
Thank you. Take care, guys.
Bye.